Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host, Vikas Swarup. The 9th of January is a special day because it marks the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, a day to celebrate the contributions and achievements of the overseas Indian community and to strengthen its links with India. January 9 was chosen to celebrate this occasion as it was on this day in 1915 that Mahatma Gandhi returned to India from South Africa. He was easily the most famous Pravasi. And so in this week's episode, we will focus on the symbiotic relationship between India and its diverse diaspora, what India is doing for overseas Indians, and what are their experiences of and expectations from India. The story of the Indian diaspora is a compelling and inspiring story. It happened more than 180 years ago as an involuntary migration of thousands of Indian landless workers who were sent out as plantation labor to different parts of the world. To Fiji, to South Africa, to Mauritius, to Guyana, to Suriname, to Trinidad, to name just a few. These people left India with nothing in their pockets, dreams in their eyes, and a scrap of paper in their hands, which was called a girmit, which meant an agreement. It was an agreement that promised that they would make a lot of money and come back to India. But it was an agreement that was never fulfilled. They never came back to India. After independence, particularly since the 70s, a number of high-skilled professionals joined semi-skilled and unskilled workers overseas. After the oil boom of the 1970s, the Persian Gulf region saw a steady increase in the population of Indian migrant workers, and today the region hosts almost 9 million Indian workers. The total overseas Indian community is now 31 million strong, the largest diaspora in the world, which includes 18 million persons of Indian origin and 13 million non-resident Indians. Today, several of the top tech companies, from Microsoft to Google to Twitter, are headed by persons of Indian origin. The same goes for 6 incumbent heads of state or government, from Guyana to Portugal to Seychelles. That is why the Pravasi has become the most significant example of India's soft power. But the diaspora is important not only in shaping the image of India abroad, it is also a very important source of remittances. Last year, India received $87 billion in inward remittances, the highest in the world. Engagement with overseas communities has become a major element of India's foreign policy under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who has pointed to the vast opportunities awaiting them in the land of their ancestors and urged them to contribute to domestic initiatives like Make in India and Namami Gange. There is a full-fledged division in the Ministry of External Affairs to handle overseas Indian affairs, and we are fortunate to have the secretary in charge of the division, Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, with us today. He is one of India's most senior serving diplomats who has been Sherpa to BRICS and ambassador to Egypt and Turkey. Joining us from Mauritius is social activist, writer and journalist Dr. Sarita Boodhoo. She has been involved with the promotion of Hindi and Indian culture in Mauritius for decades. She was instrumental in setting up of the World Hindi Secretariat in Mauritius and is the chairperson of the Bhojpuri Speaking Union. And joining us from Singapore is Mr. K.V. Rao. He has a checkered international corporate career of 4 decades, including a short stint with Singapore Civil Service. He is a trustee of Singapore Indian Development Agency, president of Singapore Fine Arts Society, and vice chair of South Asia Business Council of Singapore Business Federation, amongst others. He currently serves as the resident director ASEAN for Tata Sons. A very warm welcome to all my panelists. Let me begin with you, Secretary Sanjay. What would you say are the main pillars of India's diaspora engagement?
Thank you, Vikas, for inviting us to this panel, and a warm namaskar from Delhi to all the viewers and to my co-panelists. I'm glad you mentioned the word Pravasi because in the Indian context, that has special significance and meaning. And it basically means that we consider all members of the Pravasi community as part of our family of a fraternity. And that is extremely important as we try and understand how we craft a policy for them. We understand and recognize that Pravasis live in a different geography, and they were separated at a period of time, at a point of time in history, which is important to them. And for us, it is very important to see whether we should celebrate that point of departure or to bring about the connections that will make us lessen that pain of separation. Being a Pravasi Bengali myself, who's never really lived in the larger Bengal, I can feel what being a Pravasi means. The government's policy is based on the 4 C's approach. Connect, so we connect and establish connections with the Pravasis. Care, we extend a welcoming and warm hand of support, and we wish them to be partners with us. The 3rd C is to celebrate. The Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, for instance, is one of those occasions. And finally, contribute, because at the end of the day, we all are engaged in the same mission. We do understand, as you also mentioned, that the overseas diaspora of Pravasis are essentially 2 sets of people. We have the NRIs, or the non-resident Indians, who are citizens of India living overseas temporarily. And we have persons of Indian origin, many of whom have also adopted the overseas citizen of India card. And they would have different identities. At another level, if you look at it sectorally, many of them, and you mentioned, are professionals, excelling in their areas of work, while many, in fact, the large majority in the Gulf, for instance, are semi-skilled or unskilled workers. And therefore, we have to craft our policies accordingly and have different policies for different kinds of people in different kinds of settings. Of course, the overall objective is that we try and integrate our Pravasis into the national development agenda.
Now, you talked about the OCI card, the Overseas Citizen of India card. What are the advantages of holding an OCI card for persons of Indian origin?
Because, as you know, the Constitution of India does not provide for dual citizenship. However, as we realize, the Pravasis have a very strong emotional bond with the motherland. And so it was back in 1999 that the persons of Indian origin concept evolved, and the first OCI cards were issued in 2005. But it was really in 2015, with the merger of the OCI and the PIO cards, that we really gave a new shape to this particular identity. What we did was, it was enshrined under the Citizenship Act, is that up to the 4th generation of Indian descendants who had people of Indian origin would be recognized as overseas citizens of India. And in some cases, subsequently, as we found, particularly with the older communities, that this was also extended up to the 6th generation. Now, we have about 4 million OCI cards that have been issued till the end of last month, that is till the end of 2021. That's a small fraction of the very large community that lives overseas, but it's a very significant endorsement of the deep attachment that we have. The OCI card confers a range of benefits, which bring them at par with those of NRIs in many ways. Of course, unlike NRIs, OCIs need a visa to come into the country, but the OCI card is like a lifetime visa. They also don't have to go for police registration like many other foreigners would have to do. OCIs can own property, with the exception of farm property, of course. They can take up jobs, even in public institutions. And particularly, this is an area in which there has been a very significant parity with the citizens of India. But of course, they are different in the sense that they cannot vote or take part in elections.
Turning to you, Dr. Boodhoo, the first Gurmeetas landed in Mauritius on the 2nd of November, 1834. But very soon, they transformed the demography, the economy, and even the polity of Mauritius. Most importantly, even though situated thousands of miles away from India, they managed to keep the traditions and culture of India alive in their adopted homeland. How was this achieved?
Mauritius was in fact the first post of the great experiment of the Britishers in a 90-year-old saga of Gurmeetas movement, starting from Calcutta, the British Raj capital of India, on the river Hooghly, in the wake of the abolition of slavery. In September 1834, the first contract was signed with this in Bengali, Bhattacharya ji. In Bengali, the contract was signed between this Dhangar and of course, they put their some marks in, but it was read to them on the atlas. This having proved a very successful experiment for the British and for the white planters, the government took it over in 1843. And since then, it has become from a trickle to 450,000 4 लाख से ज्यादा गिरमिटिया लोग मॉरिशस आए. उसमें कुछ लोग गए वापस भी, but the most of them, they stayed because of the many different types of stringent rules that were made such that they could not go back. When Gandhiji came to Mauritius in 1901 from South Africa, not as a Gurmeet, not as a Mahatma, but as a lawyer, he was on passage. His ship had to refuel, and he saw the conditions of the Gurmeetas. He was really appalled by the squalor in which they were living, as he had seen also in South Africa. So he told the rich people, the well-to-do businessmen and all in Portrees, educate your children and join politics. Join politics, why? To fight for your rights. So that from Gurmeetas, over several generations, social mobility, we have been able to produce prime ministers, presidents of the republic. With their voting rights, the Gurmeetas in 1948, they elected 11 Indian members out of 19 candidates. And that was the watershed, and it was a turning point.
Turning to you now, KB. You served internationally and significantly in ASEAN. So tell us, what accounts for the extraordinary success Indians have achieved, not just in Singapore, but internationally across the world?
Let me focus on what makes the Indian tribe, as it were. You mentioned a family of Pravasis, which is 31 people around, and it's growing at perhaps the fastest pace of 2.5 million migrations a year, till I think the COVID hit us. And I think it's going to resume once again to those levels. With such a migration and a variety of people that the Indian diaspora represents. On the higher end, you have doctors, engineers, people in education, business, technology, innovation, banking, finance, multinational leaderships, and so on. On the other hand, you have marine engineers, mechanics, electricians, air conditioning people, literally, and the F&B sector has a large number of Indians. Even if you see in Japan, you will find Indian cooks in Japanese restaurants. So the level of penetration of Indian talent around the world is perhaps unmatchable. In my view, there are two things that make the diaspora succeed. One is all those who have grown up in India with Indian middle-class values. It brings an eclectic mix of simplicity, earthiness, good values, hard work, education, application, networking abilities, and also, most often than not, the ability to speak well in English makes them quite successful around the world. They're very articulate too. And this is one area which actually puts us in strength. Second is by nature, the fire in the belly for an Indian to achieve, to succeed, to arrive, to prove himself, and to contribute is so strong, with also a social conscience and a social purpose, which is a part of our DNA to give back to my neighbor, to my village, to my town, to my country, to my friend. The new wave that you see in terms of professions, you see even the diaspora taking political leadership positions around the world.
Secretary Sanjay, you just heard from our two panelists how the Indian diaspora transformed the countries that they adopted. But how are the Pravasis contributed to India's development story?
What we try and do is, when we interact with our Pravasis, is to encourage them for excellence wherever they are, following the laws of the host country that they reside in. And therefore, what we used to call in the past the brain drain has now become a brain trust for India. And this contributes itself not only in the leverage that we have overseas, but also in terms of what comes back to India. You mentioned about the remittances. It's true that we receive the highest amount of remittance globally. But if you look at it as a proportion of the GDP of India, this is something that could be even better. The Indians come in also through various forms of investments in a diverse range of sectors. And that is extremely important. What we found most recently is that the importance of ideas and experiences that Indians living abroad bring back to their communities back in India is perhaps the most significant outcome.
KV, you head Tata Sons in Singapore and have run industry leadership platforms. How can the overseas Indian community help promote business engagement with India?
Growth for India is in its international positioning both ways, in terms of inward and outward. In these two flows, the role that the diaspora Indian leaders can play are significant. If you look at remittances, I would say it's a low-hanging fruit. It is relatively small, in my view. If you're looking at direct investments, it is significant, but not that significant. But if you look at the ability of the Indian leaders, business leaders, to be able to influence, I would not be wrong to say that directly or indirectly, Indian leaders in the United States, Europe, global corporations, Asia put together, financial industry, investment arms, private equity, all of that would be directly or indirectly controlling anywhere between $6 to $7 trillion around the world. The biggest strength of India today is its talent, its youth bulge, the demographic dividend. But as I mentioned, it's still raw. It needs to be a 360-degree engagement. I'd like to add one important point, which perhaps we could start looking at. In Indian corporates, we wanted to have a representation of the fairer sex. The government promulgated that we must have some representation of women directors. I don't think we need to legislate, but we can definitely encourage every large enterprise or small enterprise that's looking at internationalization could certainly have one or two positions kept for directors who could be based overseas and who have a love for India, are familiar with the industry, and understand the internationalization value chain. It would be a shortcut for many enterprises.
Dr. Boodhoo, what were the special problems faced by the Gurmeetas, and how has the government of India facilitated their engagement with their roots?
When the Gurmeeta came here, first of all, in the first few decades, they didn't have family life. It was very hard for them. And as I mentioned already, they had to work from sunrise to sunset. And if they did not complete, they were not paid. And they had ill treatment. They suffered sheer exhaustion. They were beaten. Their wives were sexually assaulted. And their wages were withheld. Several severe laws were passed. They could not move from one district to another. And it was called the Vagrant Act, the labor law. It was so severe that these people just could not do anything.
Secretary Sanjay, KV mentioned the youth, as an area of special focus. And I know that they are a special focus of engagement for your division, since many of them have rather tenuous connections to their roots. What is the government of India doing to engage the diaspora youth?
The basic program that we adopted in the beginning was to familiarize the youth of Gurmeeta countries with their motherland. There was a program called Trace Your Roots that Sarita ji also mentioned about. There was a program which continues of the scholarships, where we bring young people across so that they can study and have their university education in India. We started a program called the Know India program, which over a period of time began to have collaborations with state governments so that we would be able to sensitize the youth, the Pravasi youth, with the achievements of the country and not simply with the cultural and heritage aspects of it. It is extremely important that we also keep in times, keep in step with the times. Every year, we celebrate a youth PBD, and every second year, when we have the main PBD convention, the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas convention, we celebrate a youth PBD just on its eve. This year, too, we had a youth PBD. And interestingly, as is necessary with the times, the theme for this youth PBD was technology and innovation. We have recently expanded the Know India program to many of the countries beyond the Gurmeetas region, because we find that in some of these countries which have relatively recent immigrants, but the youth are in the third generation perhaps, that we need to establish these links and also to deepen the connections with the developments in India which are happening at a very, very rapid pace.
At the same time, I'm sure there are some challenges that you face in engaging the diaspora. Could you mention some of them, and how has the COVID pandemic impacted this process?
Our diaspora or our Pravasi community is very, very diverse, and it's not homogeneous. And therefore, we would need to have a differentiated approach towards different communities, different age groups, and also to develop specific instruments and schemes to address specific issues of interest. For instance, as we were discussing, the Gurmeetas, which are an old community, the main establishment of contact is to establish that connection, to re-establish and rekindle those emotional bonds. We have, for instance, amongst the larger group of newer immigrants, many who are workers, many who are unskilled or semi-skilled and therefore more vulnerable. We therefore need to have a policy framework which is more caring, which is oriented towards welfare and protection. At the same time, we have a community of professionals, doctors, engineers, scientists, and so on, academics, who may be extremely successful. And for them, the set of priorities are different. So we try and bring about how they can contribute to the Indian economy, to the Indian society, to the ideas bank, and how we can also give them better benefits in terms of mobility to those countries where they wish to go, or also in terms of the kind of social security agreements that we work out for their benefit. But then, of course, there is also a category of diaspora, and you also mentioned about them, who are extremely eminent, who are heads of state and government, who may be Nobel laureates. And with them, it is really a question of establishing a connection so that their goodwill generates through the community and brings about better good. There is a new element that has come in recent times, in the last several decades, which is of students. And because students now go to many non-traditional countries as well, this becomes an issue where we have to address their concerns, particularly in times of emergencies where they may be stranded. And that brings about this thing about the COVID, because when COVID broke out, the essence of the first thrust of our reaction had to be how we deal with people who are stranded. And of course, you saw that India launched the largest repatriation exercise ever in terms of the Vande Bharat mission, which was an all-of-government effort involving the embassies overseas. And we also found that because there were so many people who were affected, that we had to generate and mobilize resources and bring about the community. The Indian community in such cases was extremely, extremely helpful.
We are running out of time. So KV, can you tell me in less than 1 minute, what more can the government of India do to promote closer ties with the diaspora?
Well, I'd quickly touch on the youth. In the global innovation ecosystem, whether it's in Singapore, UK, in the Valley, there's a disproportionate percentage of Indian innovators. Take the example of fintech in Singapore. They're full of young Indians who have come to study or come from abroad and they landed here, and they know how to put the various pieces together to succeed. I think we need to plug in better, because these are the guys who are going to drive the world in terms of its growth, in terms of new technologies over the next 10 or 20 years. I think we could do better there in engaging youth. The second, youth does two things. They also go back to India and set up their back offices because they value engineer the entire business model. And there are a lot of young people who have never looked at India. They're second, third generation diaspora guys who started new enterprises, and they go to the Bangalores, Hyderabad, and Calicutts to set up their bases there. So there is the other advantage of dealing with youth. And the other second part I would like to mention is using diaspora as mentors, as Sherpas, as trust makers, as ambassadors, hands and feet for our own high commissions and embassies to reach out better and to build greater and deeper connections.
Sarita ji, final thoughts on what more government can do?
Now, as you say, the emotional bond has been up to us. You know, it has been maintained because we are linked with the past and the future. But beyond us, the children who are coming up, they do not have the same emotional bond. But maybe through social media, IT, startup, Bollywood, films, and so on. You know, the film is a very big thing that we can explore further. And I think the youth, as you say, they are the combat. They are the one who we have to really train and bring this Indianity in them.
Thank you. Let me thank all my three panelists for this very illuminating discussion. Join me next week for a new episode of Diplomatic Dispatch. Till then, good evening and goodbye.